Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this event, Accelerating the Positive Power of Forest, Making Good on Promises, Addressing Forest Footprints, and Investing in Forest Restoration. I'm pleased to be here today with a great set of panelists to get us going with these discussions. But first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we understand as nature-based solutions, just to frame a little bit our our discussion. And forgive me, my throat is a little bit challenging today. But when we talk about nature-based solutions, we are talking about actions that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively through actions to protect sustainable managed and restore human ecosystems, providing human well-being and benefits for biodiversity. And that's what the term that we use as nature-based solutions, and I wanted just to highlight that because it's important to show that we are framing nature-based solutions as these opportunities to address other societal challenges. And within those, of course, we're going to be focusing today on the forest agenda and how important it is to promote forest protection, sustainable forest management, but also restoration. And we've been hearing a lot of the restoration actions and restoration interest at this COP, but more broadly out there, and we wanted to talk about our different approaches. I think it's important to take a little bit of a stock of the moment we are now. If I recall, back in 2014, we had the New York Forest Declaration, where many countries and non-state actors, such as companies, came together to commit to halve deforestation by 2020, and then to end deforestation by 2030. We didn't halve deforestation by 2020. So what are we going to do? Because 2030 is approaching, and we are looking with concern that governments and corporates are very far behind on their commitments. So we wanted to promote this discussion today, just to take stock of where we are, but also to have a discussion on how we can accelerate action to deliver on those commitments. I mean, there's no way that we can keep backsliding and pushing our commitments. Now, what we're going to say, our ending deforestation by 2050. I mean, I don't think we can afford that time frame anymore. And of course, what we want to do is recognize that there's no silver bullet to end deforestation and to promote restoration at the levels that the challenge of the climate and nature crisis are demanding. So we know that there has to be a mix of approaches, and we need all hands on deck to fulfill those commitments and to accelerate the action. So today, here, what we want to do in this conversation is to showcase different complementary approaches for government, corporates, and NGO action that can get us to the scale of ambition and to a right timeline to stay on track for a 1.5-degree world, while at the same time, of course, we fulfill our commitments on the global biodiversity framework and the sustainable goals. So with that, we have invited different panelists to discuss with us these different approaches and to help us outline a potential landscape of complementing efforts that can help us leverage impact at scale. One of the things that occupy most of my time these days is nature-based solutions origination platform, which is an initiative I'm leading these days, and I'm very proud and happy to share it with you today. It's a platform that aims to articulate and catalyze high-integrity, high-quality supply of nature-based solutions in key landscapes, and provide these packages of intervention that are going to be investment-ready. So that's a pillar of what we call the supply side of the platform. And in the other side, we have the pillar of the deal origination of finance pillar of the platform. And we want to do, under that pillar, is become more sophisticated with our financing approach, so we can identify, access, blend, and sequence different sources of finance to crowd the resources that are needed to get these landscapes towards sustainability. So we need, if we want to change the development paradigm of key landscapes to get them to low carbon development and to sustainability, we know that it's going to take a village. It's not going to be one initiative at a time. And with that notion, what we want to do is make sure that we are becoming sophisticated on how we use different sources of finance. Could be like foundation money as a seed money, but then to get corporate sector investments to catalyze quick action and to leverage other sources of funding like multilateral finance. So that's what I'm working on this nature-based solutions origination platform in 5 landscapes: Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, in Madre de Dios in Peru, in the Northern Haiana landscape in Madagascar, Central Annamites in Vietnam, and in the Atlantic forest in Brazil. And that's one of the approaches that we wanted to share with you today, and you will hear more on this in the session. So with this introduction, I just want to encourage you to engage actively in the discussion. We'll have time for you to ask questions to our panelists. But let's start with the conversation without further ado. And I'm going to just like quickly introduce you so then we can dive into the discussion. So we have first William Baldwin Cantello, who is Director of Nature-Based Solutions for WWF UK. Welcome, Will. Thanks for being here. We have Severin Kalongo, who is our WWF lead for forest landscape restoration in Africa. And thanks, Severin. And then, of course, we have David Croft, Head of Sustainability from Reckitt. Thanks for being here, David. And online, we can see Nicole Schwab, who is the co-head of Nature Positive Pillar at the World Economic Forum, and who also oversees the 1T.org platform. Welcome, Nicole. Thanks for joining us virtually here today. So maybe let's start with you, Will. I'd like to ask you, well, maybe you need to explain a little bit all this lingo, but I wanted to ask you how WWF aims to bring an integrated approach to different initiatives that we have put forward. Forest Forward is 1 trillion trees, and of course, I just mentioned the Nature-Based Solutions origination platform. But how we articulate these initiatives to deliver long-term and sustained protection and recovery of forests.
Thanks, Josefina. I think you can let your voice have a bit of a rest now. So thank you, everyone, and hello to everyone who might be watching online. I'll just start by saying a little bit about what Trillion Trees is and what Forest Forward is, and then how we can see those linking up, including with the Nature-Based Solutions origination platform that Josefina just described. So Trillion Trees is a joint venture between WWF, the BirdLife International, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, and we share a vision of around the world, 1 trillion trees being better protected, safe from loss or restored by the middle of the century, and we see our role in that. Most clearly being in being a voice for delivering pledges, committing to action, and particularly high-quality restoration, but also developing solutions that will enable us to act more quickly on that. And most prominently at the moment, Trillion Trees offers a reforest fund, which is a way to fund restoration now around the world with a large set of landscapes in our global portfolio, and also developing a catalyst which shares similar aims to the NBS origination platform, where we aspire to be working with landscapes who have a large landscape plan to go from perhaps small-scale restoration now to large-scale restoration in the future, by helping to understand how different finance sources can be combined to deliver that vision over the long term. And moving on to Forest Forward, and we'll weave these together in a moment. Forest Forward is a platform that WWF offers as a place for corporates to act on forests. Participants can commit to continually improving their supply chain sourcing and are supported in doing so. And this is everything from improved forestry practices, credible certification, but also indeed recommending and supporting investments in restoration and reforestation. And that there is where the origination platform and Trillion Trees can come in. So we see this as an ecosystem of initiatives within WWF that can support that action through supply chains, as well as high-quality opportunities to support forest restoration and protection of landscapes. So how might these be fit together? And I think we can borrow here from guidance that WWF has produced and talks often about on how corporates can act on their climate footprint, and borrow that and use that in a forest context. So there's 4 steps that we recommend on that. And the first is, of course, accounting and disclosing for your greenhouse gas emissions. And in this case, we might be talking about accounting and disclosing your forest footprint and identifying deforestation risk in your supply chains. And that is something that Forest Forward has a means to support. Second thing would be to set targets then to reduce that footprint and to act on your deforestation risk. And again, there's opportunities through Forest Forward to work on that. But of course, our headline is the importance of achieving deforestation and conversion free by 2025. And now we have the opportunity with science-based targets on nature to be setting holistic targets on a company's land footprint. So then the next step, and this is where I think it gets a bit more interesting, not that the first 2 aren't interesting, but the third one, there are different approaches, and this is kind of where our conversation is. So if you've done those first 2, the opportunity there is to set a financial commitment to support action on the transition, the global transition that we all need to make, and in this case, the land use transition. So setting a finance target in order for you to contribute to that transition. Again, you might find that the SPTN and Forest Forward are helpful in this, but actually this is where I think the opportunity connects with Trillion Trees and the Naturebased Solutions origination platform in order to support sustainable landscapes. But actually there are different ways of doing this, and I think while we welcome the growth in corporate investment and interest in forest restoration, I think often that's quite divorced from action on supply chains. And I just want to suggest that there might be 4 benefits for linking those 2 up more closely. So looking at restoration opportunities that are close to or inside your own supply chain. And the first one is, obviously, unlike carbon, it matters where biodiversity is lost and gained. And so if your corporate supply chain, even through best efforts, is having an impact on biodiversity, restoring and supporting ecosystems in that same landscapes or same location is significant. The second thing is that you're able to, in that instance, combine the influence of your sustainable supply or sustainable demand with an investment in restoration in a way that could create a sustainable economic benefit, even offtake agreements to support bankable MBS in that context. Thirdly, there could be benefits from a resilience of supply point of view, including boosting your social license to operate in that landscape, or even resilience to physical risk. And I think there are a small number of examples where that might have been the case already. Fourthly, and this may be not often talked about at COP, but I guess it matters from a decision-making point of view, it's obviously strengthening your brand story as a company where you're investing in restoration in a place where you have a connection through your supply chain. So that's just a little bit of a run-through as to how WWF is seeing its ecosystem of initiatives tying together and supporting a high-integrity approach. And as Josefina says, what we're interested here is really have a conversation of different ways of doing that and learning how we could create some new avenues to accelerate our impact towards those global targets.
Thank you. Thanks, Will, for outlining all these different initiatives and how they fit together. And I would like now to ask maybe you, David, how is Reckitt applying an integrated approach to addressing your forest footprint and enabling forest recovery? And in particular, can you elaborate on how you're implementing this in-setting approach within your value chains?
Thanks, Josefina. First of all, you might not know who Reckitt is. So let me try and give you a bit of background. Some of you do, but you probably know the brands. So you'll know brands like Dettol if you're in Europe, or Lysol if you're in the States, or maybe even one of the ones that leads to our in-setting approach, which is Durex, because we need natural latex from rubber farmers, smallholder rubber farmers in southern Thailand, that support a £1.5 billion brand every year. And that's where insetting becomes hugely important to us. We discovered 3 or 4 years ago that those smallholder farmers don't make enough money really to keep their communities moving forward. We began a program that made latex fair trade. We've extended that to plantation workers in Malaysia. But where we need to get to is to start to really pay those smallholders an ecosystem service payment. Because what this connects to is not just the supply system, the community that's the heart of that supply, but also, for the last 2 years, we've been on the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD. And what we see from that, and what I hear from the investor community, is very, very clear. How are we looking at biodiversity, carbon, and communities in an integrated way? And I think Will's point earlier, that if you join these up, you create multiple reasons to support and develop and strengthen. If you're only using one of those, then it starts to commoditize it, and that's not a good thing for a more sustainable future across all of those three. We've developed a very robust biodiversity metric, working alongside nature-based insetting at the University of Oxford, and building real clear qualitative and quantitative metrics for that landscape of rubber farming. And that means we work with the 1,000 smallholders. We are paying them at a premium for the latex that they supply to us. And we've been able also to engage with them and train them on agronomy. Now that means we then have the basis, the foundation of a really robust ecosystem service approach. What we can now do is identify and strengthen farming practice. So we begin from, let's make certain no further damage is done. Now, this is not a location where deforestation has been around for probably the last 100 years. But there's still things that can go wrong. There's still use of fertilizer that's too close to the watercourse that gets eutrophication moving. We're stopping that. But then we want to move up a hierarchy, and this is where the engagement and the ecosystem service payments allows us to do that. So in the first case, it's regenerative agriculture, integrated crop management, changing the fertilizer that they're using, for example. But it's also about doing new approaches for ground cover. By planting ground cover that is a nitrogen fixer, we also improve soil health, and we reduce the need for those farmers to use pesticides that damages the productivity of the rubber tree. If we move higher up the hierarchy, we start to do intercropping that brings different opportunities for them, extra income streams. And even higher still, we're looking, and we have been helping them with wildlife corridors. The local elephants love to come through the rubber plantations because rubber trees have a lot of water in them. And at night, that's what the elephants look for. Now, if you're a farmer with the best will in the world, if you've only got 3 or 4 football pitches of rubber trees and elephants take half a dozen trees a night, that damages your income straight away. So we've been working with our partners on the ground to train those farmers on how they can keep the elephants out of the plantation, because it matters. So that's biodiversity at the micro scale of soil health and at the macro scale of Asian elephants wandering through and damaging the crops. What that helps us to do through ecosystem services payments is provide longevity to those farmers. It means I'm protecting biodiversity. Our methodology allows us to monitor the carbon that comes from that plantation as well. And finally, we're creating a social impact because livelihoods are maintained. That's great for the community. It's great for the value chain of that latex for us. We can talk about it to consumers if we want to, but if we're brutally honest, it's not the first thing a consumer of Durex thinks when they're buying one off the shelf. But most importantly for me, it allows me to talk to the investor who says, so what's your financial risk on latex? And more importantly, what are you doing about it? And I can talk about the investment, which will be about £1.8 million a year to the smallholders and to the plantation workers to protect and support biodiversity and carbon in that landscape and give us confidence in the supply. And that's our insetting approach. I was going to say in a nutshell, it was a big nut. We'll go with that one.
Thank you, David. That was super interesting and clear. Maybe let's turn to you, Severin, right now, and maybe if you can explain a little bit the role of Africa 100 as a government platform, but more importantly, why is it important for achieving these Africa 100 targets for companies and partners to really take this integrated action on forest footprint so addressing deforestation, but also restoration.
Thanks, Josefina, and hi, everyone. Just to protect my interest, I'm speaking on behalf of Mamadou, who is the head of the Forest Camp Restoration Initiative in Africa, and also being a partner to the initiative, but also a member of the management team. I think I'll share my insight, could be personal reflection, not reflecting the initiative, but at least to share what I can contribute to the initiative. So the Forest African Landscape Restoration Initiative is a government-led initiative, and it's under the IUDA NEPAD, part of the African Union Commission. And being a government-led initiative is a convener, being a continental platform, but the way they do work as an initiative is they have sub-platforms. And the private sector is one of the platform, of the sub-platform. And in this platform, a working group of the private sector is the initiative is doing to convene private sector players in the region through regional economic commissions, and to bring also regional corporates to speak about restoration. And what they deliberate is taken back to the respective regional economic commissions, and then through the apex bodies at regional level, they implement with other partners at national and regional level. And it has been so for a number of years, but of course that it is from other also partners, it's not that much productive, but the initiative is not pushing back. They continue to engage, and as we speak, they have some few partners, corporates, which are like leading examples. One of them is the Bezos. Has been like a leading financial partner to the initiative, and a lot has been invested in Africa in restoration for multiple benefits. And the other corporates, there are a number of reasons why they don't want to really to step out and join to be financial partners. First of all, they don't want to like disclose or to be transparent in what they are doing. Because if you subscribe to the initiative, the Afro 100 initiative, it's obvious you need to be open and share your targets, how you do it, even the source of funds. It has to be clear before you invest in the initiative. So Afro 100 initiative is pushing for partnership to make sure that, yes, we're in this trouble of being slow in terms of implementing restoration targets in Africa because we don't have enough capacity. Enough capacity in terms of technical skills, but also enough capacity in terms of financial resources. So putting all the private sector and other partners together, we join like efforts and put our resources together. It becomes big, and then we can really have an impact at landscape level. So through the regional economic commissions and also the corporates, apex bodies at regional level, this is an ongoing engagement. The working groups normally meet on a monthly basis where they deliberate and agree on how to push for things which put them together, like corporate sector. And the other observation in here, which is the initiative is pushing for, is to make sure that the private sector investing in the initiative have like informed targets. Just to borrow the initiative by WWF and other partners, the science-based targets is really important. And what we call the private sector to do is to subscribe to like-minded organizations like WWF to learn on how they can set their restoration targets, just to show the way they can improve and minimize, reduce the carbon footprints. Just to give you an example of three corporates that I am aware of. Start Oil is very active in Tanzania, and they wanted to support restoration with about $200,000. And they came to me, Severin, we have this $200, $200,000 we want to give you for restoration to be spent for 4 months. Wow, interesting. So tell me your story. What do you do? I want to see how you are really accountable to managing your supply chain. What do you mean? I said, okay, you are a transporter. I want to see how you minimize the use of fossil fuel. How many trucks will be converted to use electricity or gas or some other alternate power energy source other than fossil fuel? We never thought about that. Let us think about that. So, and another organization which wanted to invest in restoration, and they were not really responsible for the footprint reduction. It was a commercial company, no, a commercial bank, and they wanted also support restoration. And I was asking, I know being a commercial bank, you are using lots of paper to how are you going to manage that? So we should continue using paper. Why not cut down paper? I said, the more papers you use, the more forests are being cut. If you want to support a restoration, making sure that you also try to minimize and you become even paperless if possible. So these are the issues that the initiative is trying to communicate to corporates and to show that if you invest in restoration efforts, you need to come back and make sure that you are responsible in your supply chain as well. Thank you, Safina.
Thank you so much, Severin, and thanks for bringing those real-life examples, because it's very often that we see that sometimes people don't understand what the right hand is doing and what the left hand is doing, so thanks for that. Let's go over to you, Nicole. Thanks for being here with us today. And if you don't mind, could you also give us a very brief explanation of 1T.org? But also, how does 1T.org support a high-integrity approach to restoration through your engagement with companies that are making pledges to support forest protection and recovery? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. So 1T.org is the World Economic Forum's Trillion Trees platform, and we've set up to really with this vision of being a platform to support the restoration movement. We have the broader vision of conserving, restoring, and growing 1 trillion trees by 2030. And the order, conserve, restore, grow, is really important. I'll get back to that on your point of high integrity. And since the beginning, we've been working with the Trillion Trees Partnership with WWF to really join up our efforts. And often people say, oh, but there's another 1 trillion trees, and we get confused. But actually, it's just one movement. And internally, we're quite cohesive and really working closely together. So the way we work with companies is our aim is really to raise corporate ambition and action, but not any type of action, obviously high integrity action. And the way we do that is we really do 4 things. So on a monthly basis, we host knowledge exchange series for the companies that are in our community and those who are interested, where we invite different experts and different speakers on topics that range from monitoring to high integrity carbon credits to how to choose the right implementation partners. And we also have an opportunity for companies to share experiences and share questions. And so just as an example, last week, we had a webinar focusing on the new paper that was issued in the journal Nature on the integrated global assessment of the natural forest carbon potential by the Crowther Lab and more than 200 other scientists. And I'm giving that as an example because obviously the paper shows very clearly that priority is to protect existing forests. And that second, in terms of achieving this forest carbon potential. It's really about reconnecting fragmented landscapes through community-led restoration. So we really try to encourage these kinds of conversation. The second thing we do, as you mentioned, we have a pledging platform, and we now have over 90 companies that have made a pledge. The pledges come in the form either of numbers of trees or hectares conserved, hectares restored, or financial commitments, or in some cases, carbon sequestration. So we try to get a bit of an equivalence. So these 90 pledges amount to more than 8 billion trees, more or less, right? But it's obviously an approximation. And what's also important is the prerequisite for companies to make a pledge is that they need to have a credible net zero goal, such as an SBTI, because as was said previously by some of the panelists, we need to have an integrated view here. So it's not just about investing in a restoration project, it's also about, you know, the decarbonization of the company's core operations. And I'll get to some of the other pieces that were mentioned in terms of the nature strategy as a whole. So we don't make that a prerequisite, but obviously more broadly at the forum, we also have a lot of work on nature positive transition pathways, and we're starting to connect that with our 1T.org initiative. The third point is we connect interested companies with implementation partners. So Trillion Trees is one of our implementation partners. And I was very interested also to hear what you mentioned about the origination platform. I mean, we often get all sorts of requests, and we try to have, you know, the right partners that we can channel this corporate interest to in terms of implementation, because we are obviously not implementers. We are really a platform that can bring all these actors together. And then finally is the monitoring and reporting on the progress of the implementation. We're going through a second cycle where each company that has made a pledge by last June, needs to report on the progress. We encourage companies to put their sights on Restore, but of course, different corporates are using different monitoring tools, instruments, platforms, so it's not possible to standardize, but obviously we encourage the use of these different instruments. And in January, we are going to release in the form of a dashboard the progress implementation on those pledges. So we see our role as bringing transparency and accountability into the system. We obviously don't verify ourselves, but we can again just serve this role of a platform to make everything much more transparent and to encourage learning and more ambition with this high integrity lens.
Thank you very much, Nicole. That was super interesting, and I think with your intervention and the interventions of our panelists, we have a very rich landscape of different efforts and initiatives that are ongoing. I'd like to just highlight that most of you talk about the need for transparency, the need for disclosure, and the need for integrity of the demand. And I think that's something that is very important when we talk. We all need to focus on investable opportunities that are high quality and that are going to get us to system transformation. But we also need to take care, and that's the quality part, but the integrity part also is the demand side integrity and the reason of why corporates are doing things, right? Like the claims is going to be very important, that you are doing this not to avoid decarbonizing or to offset the emissions, but actually to add on and to help us build resilience for the corporates. Excuse me. Of course, it's about their own supply chains, but for people, it's about their livelihoods. So it's very important to start bringing these two angles together. And thanks for highlighting all these ingredients of quality and integrity. I know that was a lot of information, so I just want to take a pause here and see if there's any questions from the audience. Yes, please. Hold on for a second. I think we need to give you a microphone.
My question's for Racket and the ecosystem services payments. Sounds like that's a pretty direct relationship, and I was just wondering if you could tell a little bit about the mechanism that you use to facilitate those payments.
Yeah. Your ability to make that type of connection depends on how vertically engaged you are, and for some crops that works really well. and this is true for everybody, not just Reckitt, it's true for everybody, the proximity to the origin of the supply chain will vary depending on what the crop is and how you use it. In our case, in order to make this work, we knew that we had to develop a relationship with the farming community who is indirectly connected to us. They grow the rubber trees, they provide the latex, that gets processed, that then comes to our factory. It's only 2 steps away, so that's not bad. But what we also knew was that it would only work if the farmer infrastructure was more resilient and more robust. And so we worked with the Fair Rubber Association and our partner on the ground, Earthworm Foundation, to really strengthen and help the farmers to build a collective, which meant that we could work more effectively across the 1,000 farmers. And also they were set up as an entity. So money transfers to the cooperative as a whole. They then disperse it to individual farmers based upon volume that's provided. And that will then grow further. When I've done similar work on coffee and cocoa, at a smallholder level, the biggest challenge is that weakness of farmer infrastructures. And how you can build that depends on the location, how close you are, but also your propensity, I think, to help farmers work more effectively together. Whenever I've seen knowledge transfer, if I tell you and you tell 5 people and they tell 5 more people each themselves, the strength of the message gets diluted all the way down. My experience and what we've seen with the rubber farmers, but also in cocoa in the past, is if we train the whole group, a group of 30, 40, 50, 100, in our case 1,000, then that knowledge transfer happens much more effectively. And that gives us much more confidence that the agronomy is put into place. It also helps those farmers work more effectively together as a collective. And so they look out for each other. They challenge each other to put the best practice into place, which for us is hugely important. It means that productivity goes up, quality goes up, but the confidence is greater that the measures are being taken to strengthen biodiversity, protect biodiversity. And that infrastructure is critical to that conversation, I think.
Thanks, David. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, please.
I have, thank you. But it's also for Reckitt, I'm afraid. David, you mentioned wildlife corridors for elephants, and I was wondering, in the context of nature-based payments, can you see a scenario where land is actually taken out of production and given over to restoration, conservation, because there's a nature-based solutions payment element as an incentive?
Yes, potentially I can. I mean, I think we look at the whole landscape. So we're able to see the locations of the farms, the nature of the landscape around them. Are they adjacent to or even inside forest environments, or are they in a much more developed area? And I think you can then work through, because the biodiversity risk to us, if I take the TNFD perspective, is not just specific to the farm itself. It's the landscape level conversation. And in the work that we've done with Oxford, we've been able to really clearly map the biodiversity at the total landscape level. And so we then are able to think about interventions that work across the landscape level. Now, my preference is to be on farm, adjacent to farm first. But then beyond that, other positive activity that strengthens biodiversity in the landscape is equally helpful. And that's where I see that type of protective approach coming. Because but the key thing is, it is for us an ongoing mitigation of risk. It's not something that if I was buying maybe a voluntary carbon product that has a nature benefit, but that nature benefit is completely remote to my value chain. That doesn't, for me, that's not as high value. We work on a degrees of separation. We want to have 1 degree of separation from the value chain at the most, 2 we'll accept. And that's what we're starting to see give us most longevity, because it's ongoing commitment to support that landscape. And what is really clear in the biodiversity conversation, just as it is with the water conversation, is location matters. That's why we've been taking similar approaches on water in other parts of the world. In India, for example, we've helped support, with WWF's help, aquatic ecosystems on the Ganges, but also in river basins nearby to some of our sites. And what that has meant is water levels have risen. There's been reforestation because planting helps to support the water table, prevents runoff, stabilizes the water courses. It's introducing new wildlife. There was an unintended consequence that a farmer told me about. The leopard jumped over the fence from the protected forest and started eating his cattle, which meant we had to help those farmers in a different way as well. But thankfully, WWF have some big cat specialist in India that is very useful for us. Surprisingly, Reckitt didn't have that internal knowledge. So we see it as a total landscape conversation, and there's value in each of them, to answer your question. And it's just a case of what is the best impact we can create, and the menu can be quite wide, as long as it's within that landscape impact.
Just to add to that question, one example, Sabah Softwoods in Sabah have done exactly that, and rather than receiving a payment, they took an area out of production of timber to create an elephant corridor between two protected areas, precisely because the loss they were incurring was so great that actually investing in and taking that out of production was saving them money. So, I mean, it's a specific example, but I'm sure you've seen others, Tim, as well. But it happens.
Thanks, Will. Any other questions? If not, I do have other questions. I wanted to ask you, Severin, because sometimes I perceive there's a disconnection between government action and corporate action. And I think there's good intentions in both sides, but everybody's like doing their own thing in the corner, and sometimes efforts undermine each other. From your perspective, working with the government and supporting government commitments under the Africa 100, what would be the key actions you would ask corporates to take to make restoration efforts of government successful?
Yeah, thanks, Safina, once again. I guess the corporates in this room could walk away of this room with this message. We know the situation we are in now is because we have not been responsible for the environment, and we are all suffering the consequences of the impact of climate change, although we suffer differently depending on where we are in this globe. So we should really courageously decide what to do and what to invest now. The first suggestion I would say, they should consider to be part of the African Forest Restoration Initiative in Africa as financial partners, and then they become the part of the working group where they can discuss and see on how their impact or their investment could bring impact in the restoration in the continent. And secondly, they could consider being partners to some of the F100 partners, such as WWF and other organization. And thirdly, they could even also consider supporting F100 member countries. You know, I just heard yesterday, they have gotten to a level of 35 countries in Africa. So you might consider to really support those countries because they have the FR strategies and some other instruments which could guide on how you can invest. And the fourth, you might consider working with other like-minded organizations which are active in a restoration space, but with clear theory of change, clear narrative on how your investment could be accounted for.
Thank you, Severin. Super clear. Thanks for those points. And now on the other side, Nicole, I want to ask you, maybe how do coalitions such as the Consumers Goods Forum and Forest Positive Coalition enable and support pledging companies to really achieve their ambition? So it's not how to go from pledges to implementation.
Thank you. Yes, I think the first thing I want to say is that I feel like the time is right now to start connecting all of these things, right? So on the one hand, you have the supply chains, right, and looking at removing deforestation from supply chains, which some of these coalitions are working on. And here we're talking about the conservation and restoration, and Will earlier explained how, indeed, with WWF, you're connecting these. And similarly, I think with the work that's been done by, the World Economic Forum, but others as well, in terms of the nature positive strategies, right, and transition pathways and what that looks like, I really feel we're at a time where we can start to have a much more systemic perspective and have these conversations together. So again, we're not just focusing on carbon, we're not just focusing on biodiversity, we're not just focusing on halting deforestation, but we can start to really look at this as an integrated approach and an integrated strategy. And I think that's where some of these coalitions can be very helpful because, of course, in each of these areas, a lot of expertise is required, which often is not necessarily available. And we see more and more companies entering into the space that are perhaps newer. There are some that are very sophisticated because they've been working on this for a long time, but what we need now is to mainstream this and to get much more players engaged. And I think that's where these coalitions can play a huge role because they can bring some of that expertise, some of that experience, and also some of those connections to the landscapes. As you mentioned, we often hear companies coming to us and saying, look, we want to make an investment, but where do we start, right? How do we even start? And so the more we have this almost like this framework with different partners who can bring their expertise at each of these different points, the easier we make it for more and more players to come in and to really create this movement that we need.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for highlighting the evolution of thinking. I think because we get the policy signals at the global level in silos, right? Like in the UNFCCC and then the CBD, and everything is fragmented, that we forget that a landscape is not only forest or is not only agriculture, but it's a mix of things, and we need to make it work for the landscape and not for a single project, because otherwise we don't get to systems transformation. So I have a question from the audience, but David, do you want to comment on this point before?
I just want to reinforce that point. I think it's absolutely critical that we help, particularly the private sector, understand that joining these things up is much more effective and gives them much more value and opportunity. Unfortunately, sometimes the signals, when we work in silos, get answered in a very simplistic way, and it creates unintended consequences. Get a carbon solution because you need to balance your carbon, because you need to report on the amount of carbon, you need to show that you're offsetting it. At one level, okay, but actually in this conversation we're seeing that it doesn't join up. I was even looking at something on EU deforestation regulation, ostensibly perfectly good, but actually it's going to mitigate, or it could mitigate, against smallholders being part of global value chains. And in the case of palm, they're 45% of the global palm supply. If they're not part of a global value chain, they won't earn as much money. If they don't earn as much money, the risk of them chopping more forest down to supplement their income goes up. It's too easy to think about one siloed approach. We have to join these conversations up if we're going to make a real difference that's lasting. That's the critical thing, that's lasting.
Thanks for that. I cannot agree with you more. This tunnel vision that we often have, and in these discussions, it's been the carbon tunnel vision, that everything is about carbon, and the entry point is, in fact, in my work and under the Nature-Based Solutions Origination Platform, we are convinced and are promoting the carbon actually can be a nice byproduct if you get it right for people and nature. But if you use only the carbon as an entry point, is very, very weak and an intervention, because it might not be durable and sustainable in the long term if it doesn't make sense for people and nature. I want to go to the audience. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks. So this is a question for all the panel. It's quite a challenging one. Based on my experience, I've worked in the Forest Positive Coalition where I chaired the soy working group. I've worked for Tesco for several years on soy sourcing, so I've struggled with this question for a long time. But essentially, it's the kind of disconnect between products coming into your supply chain and justifying an investment in those versus justifying an investment in a landscape where you might not know that for certain that the products of that landscape are coming directly into your supply chain. And it's very much the case with major bulk commodities, palm oil, soy. They're traded globally, mixed at multiple points in the supply chain. It's very difficult for an end-of-chain operator like a supermarket or even a manufacturer, food service company to say, this crop that was produced by this farm is absolutely in my supply chain, guaranteed. That's what the EU DR is demanding, which is part of the reason it's extremely challenging. But I wonder how we can bridge that gap between only justifying things that are directly in our supply chain and being able to justify things on the basis of the benefits of landscape investment. Because I think the scale of financing for something that's in my supply chain, that's operational finance, that's huge. Whereas if it's only ever thought of as a benefit, for the greater good, it's only ever going to be kind of charitable scale one-off grants, which are at best of times quite small. So how do we bridge that gap? And I'd like to hear all the ideas, please.
That's a question of the $1 million. Who wants to?
Should I start? I fully agree with you. We are really going through that challenge and have some examples that I'll share with you. A couple of reasons. Two is the first one, we need to see on how we can be transparent to show the source of the commodities. It has been clear, particularly in Africa. There's lots of tricks how people could really produce something without declaring the source. That is one. So it's all about compliance. We should consider certification standards, at least to show evidence of what we are doing. Secondly, some of the commodities could be attractive, good business, but we don't have enough to ensure sustainability. And that's another mismatch in terms of the commodities we do have at landscape level, getting to the required supplier or the one who is demanding. So what I would advise in here, one of the business models which was very good, I would say in Tanzania, we thought is going to lift up a lot of environmental hazards. We had a company was producing briquettes through recycled material, wood-based recycled material and some material, and they can no longer sell to EU market due to the EUDR. And because they cannot show the evidence of this recycled material. And everything is like, oh, hold on, wait till when we are convinced. So let's have systems which could show that we are accountable, we are transparent from the supply all the way through the value chain up to the supermarkets on where our commodities go. Thanks.
Will, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I don't know whether I've got a new idea, but I think in your description, what you were describing were the things that I would have said in response. Actually, before this session, I was thinking about, well, what I outlined, what would get in the way of doing that. And one of the issues was maybe you don't know where your supply is coming from. As you say, and bouncing back what you said into an answer, I think the EUDR and now the UK due diligence legislation will be forcing that visibility. So that ought to change. And and I might loop back to that in a second. But the second thing is, as you say, so you don't know the exact producer, but you know the jurisdiction, and there's a great incentive there to invest in jurisdictional solutions, which then collective action from multiple corporates can be at play. And thirdly, maybe the alternative or complementary to that is instead of investing in a place, invest in the system solutions that are needed to address that problem, whether that's traceability platforms, whether it's advocacy for policy change. And that loops me back to, at the start when I was laying out these steps, I meant to get to number 4, which is companies advocating for policy change, ambitious policy. And just this week, we were at risk, I think, of leaving this COP with the UK government being one that's funding work on forests overseas, but not addressing its footprint and doing the opposite of what we were talking about today. But the due diligence legislation was finally moved forward, and it was announced yesterday. And 6 supermarkets, including Tesco and Sainsbury's and Waitrose and others in the UK, wrote to the Prime Minister and said, you need to put that in place. And that was a compliment to work that they had done collectively to commit to halving the environmental footprint of shopping baskets, investing in restoration and transition in Cerrado, and so on. So it's this whole package that's needed. But that traceability, up to a point, has to happen, at least to jurisdictional level, to be able to be confident that we actually are taking the due diligence steps that, at least in the UK and the EU, is going to be required. But you're quite right, David, in pointing out that the risk in Indonesia right now is that is responded to by excluding smallholders. And so then your investment priority becomes, and it's something WWF is working actively on, enabling smallholders to demonstrate their supply, because that's a big, big, big risk.
Yeah, I think what you end up doing is thinking about, I'm going to be careful how I phrase this, blended solutions. Because there's certain areas where market actors and supply chains will work, and there are other areas where you need non-market actors also to lean in. And maybe that activity around smallholders in Indonesia needs that blend. But also, to sort of answer your point, it's going to be, first, traceability, transparency on origins matters significantly. It will always be challenging in some commodity crops, just because consolidation at process point, even with technology, does not mean you're going to be able to know categorically which farm in which diameter of location supplied today. And so you end up having to work a little bit at a landscape level, maybe not 1,000 miles square, but maybe 25 kilometer diameter. But then I think your further point is actually answered not so much just on the mechanics of the landscape, but actually this is about the science of change. We know the science of climate change, we know the science of biodiversity to a reasonable degree. This is about the science of change within organizational thinking. And oftentimes this conversation revolves around discussion of risk. And it might be risk that the organization feels, or it might be risk that the planet feels, but sometimes inside an organization, those two things aren't connected. That's why I'm a big fan of TNFD, because it starts to bring nature into the heart of a business conversation. And then it's not just about risk. It becomes one of resilience. And if you're lucky, it even becomes one of opportunity. And inside a business, and I can categorically guarantee this, if you're talking about resilience and opportunity, then motivation is higher. Whereas if you're just talking about risk, and frankly, this is true, I suspect, for many of us as individuals, it's an insurance conversation. It's how do I reduce the cost to manage that risk? Think about when you last renewed your car insurance. If you hadn't had an accident and the price went up, did you like the feeling? Did you phone round and try and get cheaper insurance? Most people do, which is why we see digital car insurance working so well in the platforms. If you can find added value points, like it gives me more resilience, it balances a nature-related risk as well as a carbon risk, or it helps me address and support human rights issues or stronger community links, or actually I can shout about it to my consumer or to my investors, then your propensity to be more broad in your thinking and to invest more and longer is much stronger. And I think it's up to us sometimes to make certain, A, that we don't see things in silos, and B, there are multiple value points that create opportunities that drive the sort of investment you're talking to at the landscape level as well, because that's where resilience comes from.
Thanks, David. And I just want to say that we are out of time. It went very quickly, and I think it's because we were having a very interesting discussion. I want to thank all our panelists for being here today. Thanks, Nicole, for joining us remotely. And I think my takeaway is that we need all hands on deck to address the twin crises that we are facing, and the need to collaborate and have integrated approaches is evident. I don't think anybody is questioning that anymore. It's just how to make that happen and how to bring all the efforts and initiatives to work in collaboration versus in terms of undermining each other. So thank you for being here. Do you want to say something?
Just a quick thank you to the Trillion Trees team for organizing the event as well.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.